Hi, welcome back to A Second of Context with Dr. Rosner. Today we'll be talking about the history of fake news. Now, perhaps many of you thought that fake news emerged from the ether in the 2016 presidential campaign, but of course that's not true at all. Because fake news, as this particular illustration by Frederick Oper illustrates, is as old as news itself. And it certainly flourished in the 1890s, as we'll see. It also flourished in the colonial era. Of course, at that point, we heard and read news of devil births in areas like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And of course, that news was spread at the behest of the royal governor and through newspapers like the Boston Newsletter. Moving forward in the partisan era of the early American Republic, fake news was still rampant in party-subsidized newspapers and pamphlets. Fake news even included sensationalized accounts about George Washington's teeth. Fake news, in fact, would continue as we moved into the era of the commercial press. Of course, the commercial press was given to us by penny press publisher Benjamin Day in 1833. He gave us the New York Sun. And that newspaper was built on the commercial model, one predicated based upon circulation and advertising. And in order to build a readership, Benjamin Day and his editors, they circulated hoax journalism, including the Great Moon Hoax, which was a series of stories about a real telescope, but the sensationalized visions of that telescope. False accounts of another world on the moon. Of course, there was an agenda behind the circulation of that fake news because Benjamin Day was sick and tired of the sixpenny papers in New York stealing his news and reprinting it in their papers. And so it was a way of teaching those newspaper publishers a lesson. Of course, a lot of notable Americans, including Mark Twain himself, were implicated in hoax journalism. It was a very vibrant form of journalism throughout the end of the 19th century. So much so that by the 1890s, a newspaper in Connecticut reported that the Connecticut state legislature was seeking an end, seeking to legislate against the rampant fake news that was created, according to that newspaper, by correspondents who made up news in order to earn $5 or $10 and make a living. Now, of course, correspondents were blamed for the so-called fake news of the late 19th century. But the Associated Press, Newswire, and newspaper publishers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst were implicated in the spread and circulation of fake news as well. In fact, if you look at news accounts in the 1890s, you see a lot of criticism and critique of the so-called Western Wildcat Wire and how they hadn't established news credibility checks. They weren't verifying the validity and credibility of news sources. And so fake news was running rampant in our country and across the globe. And even though newspaper publishers and state legislatures, they blamed the correspondent, in fact, the person who should have bore the most blame were newspaper publishers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who, as this particular Frederick Oper illustration from Puck notes, they were raking in huge sums of money off of fake news. We wouldn't see the end of fake news, even amid the birth of the New York Times and its motto, all the news that is fit to print. Of course, that comes to us in 1897 when Chattanooga native Adolph Ox purchases the New York Times from original owner publisher Henry Jarvis Raymond. And at that moment in time, he's lamenting the sheer volume of fake news and sensational news accounts that had come to a head in the period around the Spanish-American War, a period in which newspaper publishers encouraged the publication of pseudo-events like Nellie Bly's Race Around the World and misinformation around the Spanish-American War, in which they encouraged advocacy journalism around Evangelica Cisneros and the publication of news that wasn't verified around who was responsible for the sinking of the Maine. Of course, those newspaper publishers fanned the flames of the Spanish-American War, and Ox sought to remedy that after he lamented the volume of fake news. And he sought to do that through the detached objective model that the New York Times came to personify in the 20th century. But of course, we know that that didn't end the practice of fake news, nor did it end the practice of sensationalized news. And in fact, we still see the spread of fake news even today. Now, of course, we also see a presidential actor who impugns the credibility of legacy news, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and cable news, such as CNN, by impugning it as fake news, by reducing its credibility in that way. And of course, that narrative works because objective news and legacy news media outlets have been under attack since the 70s as the Eastern establishment news media. It's important to keep in mind, of course, that the legacy news has been under attack from both the right and the left, and that there are real flaws in an objective news model. It's also important to reflect on what models might help us to curb the tide of fake news and sensationalistic journalism that we're saturated with at this point in time. Should we turn to an advocacy news model? One that emphasizes that positionality through transparency? I don't know. It's certainly something to consider. Thank you for sharing a moment of context with me.